All right. How is everyone?
Well, thank you.
Yeah, good. Any thoughts, questions from last satsang? I was wondering if I'm going to mute everybody, and then if you have a question, raise your hand, because then that will help with the sound. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and otherwise I'll just start talking. No questions? All right. So when you start off on page 24, I believe, where we left off, 34 Maharishi. Before last week, we talked about the infinite I capital. And Maharishi says, there's no creation, the state of realization. When one sees the self, the world is not seen. So see the self and realize that there has been no creation. See yourself first and foremost. You are taught the truth. Instructions have been given. See who you are. That is the whole instruction. The only thing that matters is that you see the self. This can be done wherever you remain. The self must be sought within. The search must be steadfast. So that's all on page 24 of this book. And I talked about last week how when I would read until something grabbed me, something resonated. Otherwise, I would just continue to read. And one thing that struck me is where it says in paragraph 34, so see the self and realize that there has been no creation. And that's an interesting concept. So I would think, what I would do is say, well, why is there no creation? Why would he make that statement? And I would think about what concept do I need here to understand that there's no creation? And so I would go back and retrieve the pointer that there in Vedanta, there's creation, maintenance, and destruction. Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So there's this energy that you could say, you call it an energy, and this energy creates, and the energy maintains, and the energy destroys, gets destructed. So you have a seed, and that's created into a small little sapling, and that turns into a tree. That's the creation aspect. And then the tree is maintained for the duration of its life. And then it starts to die away and it begins to get destroyed. And then the tree falls, is destroyed, and begins to disintegrate back into the earth. So that's creation, maintenance, and destruction. So notice that all happens in duality. Creation, maintenance, and destruction all happens in duality. So, and remember that creation, maintenance, and destruction occurs when the self notionally steps outside of itself. So in self-realization, there is that's all there is consciousness. There's not consciousness in motion or consciousness at rest. There's no label to identify consciousness. To label consciousness would to start putting limits on it and conditions. Creation is one limitation on the big self. So therefore he says, and realize that there has been no creation. Now, you might even be able to understand this a little deeper using Ramesh's concept of the thinking mind and the working mind. When the working mind is happening, there's total involvement in the activity at hand, so that the person doing the activity and the activity itself merges into doing. And there is no feeling of creation, maintenance, or destruction. They're simply doing. Because if creation happens, then something comes out of that creation, and something that comes out of that creation is an object. And when something comes out of that creation as an object, then there's a creator, subject-object relation. And then there's creating. So the subject, object, and the verb of creating. And that's dualistic. And there's a separateness or a separation of between subject and object, creator, and what that creator creates. So then we can take another example from Atmabodha and where it says that for those who do not directly perceive the sun is sun being the self. The sun can be indirectly perceived in the bucket of water as a reflection. So I don't know what the sun, I've never seen the sun. I don't know to look up in the sky. I've never seen the sun before. And someone comes along and says, look at this big bucket of water. In that water, you'll see the sun. And that's a reflection of the sun. It is and it is not the sun at the same time, in the sense that it takes on most of the qualities of the sun, and it is that which is being reflected, the sun. It's not the moon, but it's the sun that's being reflected. But at the same time, it's not the actual sun. Because if I say to the person pointing out the sun, I say, oh, well, the sun who has seen the sun, I'd say the sun is bright, right? And he goes, yeah, sun is bright. Sun appears to be round, right? And he goes, yes. The sun seems to emit light, right? Yes. And I'd put my finger in the water in the bucket where the sun is being reflected, and I say the sun is cool, right? No, the sun isn't cool. The sun is very extremely hot. So that's where the limitations of trying to describe that which can't be described come in. And also, whenever you're trying to objectify that which can't be objectified, pure subjectivity, you come into limitations in some type of description. But one way, what he's pointing to when they're saying there's no creation, is basically another way of saying there's not a creator, there's not a creation, and there's not creating, and there's simply self. And so one reflected quality to try to understand that, the self where there's no creation, is simply being in the moment. Where there's no creating, there's no one creating, and there's not an object being created, but simply creation is happening, or whatever you want to call it, doing is happening without a doer. So that's kind of like saying, oh, well, okay, then the sun is, I'm looking at the bucket and I'm looking at the reflected sun. And so the sun is light, correct? And you'd say, yeah. So he's pointing out one aspect, a quality of pure consciousness, of pure subjectivity, that you might be able to indirectly at least grasp. Any questions? If you have a question, just raise your hand up and unmute yourself. All right. I'll move on. Okay. So we're in chapter 4 now, on page 25. It says, find the source. And this will be an interesting chapter. So 38, paragraph 38 says, questioner, what is the practice? Probably implied in that question is, how do I get there? What do I do? But he's saying, what is the practice? Maharishi, constant search for I, the source of the ego. Find out who I am. Now, it says, find out who I am. Some translations, and Ramesh has talked about that the pure translation from who I am is really what am I, not who am I, but what am I. Anybody want to take a stab at what might be the slight, subtle, but significant difference between asking what am I and who am I? Mary, you want to unmute yourself? Or I can do it. Okay, Mary?
Yeah. Well, who always refers to a person or a living thing? Like, no, it would be a person, and it doesn't refer ever to an object.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So by saying, what am I, it would help to remove that kind of personhood from it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So when you ask who am I, you're taking the identification of who am I, which is personal, and you're trying to find out another level of personality. Whereas when you ask what am I, it's impersonal. There's no personality involved in asking what am I. So asking what am I is trying to go from the personal to the impersonal. Because if you say who am I, you usually say what is your name, your gender, age, job, that's who am I. What am I? Then you start to begin to look at it at an impersonal level. So he says the pure I is the reality. So whenever I see reality, again, I would stop. What is reality? And the reality is, the definition of reality is that which never changes. So anything that changes is not reality, which should not be confused with that which exists in real or unreal in that way. Reality has to, or unreality has to be with that which is changing and the changeless. So then the next sentence he says, the absolute existence, consciousness, bliss. When that is forgotten, all miseries crop up. When that is held fast, the miseries do not affect the person. So I think it was last week, Mary asked, is the mind in turmoil, is that real? And here he is saying that is not real, because turmoil changes. Even the mind changes. So the mind is not real in the sense that it changes. And the cornerstone of Advaita Vedanta says that we are reality, and that which never changes is reality. So there's something that recognizes the changes within you. And that is what he's saying, to find that source. So what is it that observes or witnesses you as a toddler, you as a teenager, you as a young adult, middle adult, and older adult? There's something constant that is observing that, is aware of that, is acknowledging that. So he says that's it's absolute existence, consciousness, bliss, which is in Sanskrit Sat Chit Ananda. And he's saying, hold on to that. But when that is forgotten, all miseries crop up. When that is held fast, the miseries do not affect the person. Now, so I would say, well, what does this mean on a practical level instead of a conceptual level? Well, in any situation, you can think of, and you can extrapolate a lot of different stories and concepts just from this, another cornerstone of Advaita Vedanta, Sat Chit Ananda, existence, knowledge, and bliss, which is never changing, which means existing. Things exist. There's existence. Let me take that back. Things exist. There's existence, and then things exist. So existence comes first, and then things exist. And things exist either for a short period of time, long period of time, or a middle period of time. But so then you start thinking, I mean, this is such a powerful concept that if you start delving into Sat Chit Ananda, is existence, knowledge, and bliss, then you can start thinking, okay, well, there's existence. And then out of that, things exist. And things exist either for a short, middle, or long period of time. So now we've introduced the concept of time. So now we can see why the sages say what we're pointing to is timeless. All right, so there's existence at the absolute level. And I think our Steve asked last week that Sat Chit Ananda is the concept that is first comes out of pure subjectivity, and notionally we have this idea, this concept, the Sat Chit Ananda. And you'll start seeing why Sat Chit Ananda is an important concept, because when you find that source in any situation, then you start eliminating all other concepts or misunderstandings that cause misery. So there's existence, and then we say things exist either for a short, long, or long period of time. Things change. Death exists within time. So, and that's just within the concept of existence. There are multiple concepts that can be an overlay over existence. One is time, one is death, change, pairs of opposites, likes and dislikes. All these come out of this idea of existence. So on a practical level, what we would do is try to look for the unchanging in any changing situation. Look for the unchanging in any changing situation. So let's just take the body. The body changes, correct? And at some point, it's going to die. So what is it that I can look for that is perceiving these changes of the body? And what is it that I can look for that in any moment I feel this is the moment for this particular stage of the body that seems to be, it's going to last forever. So if you look at your body right now, you think, I'm not even going to comprehend death. That can come out of fear that you just don't want to think about it or avoid it. But there's something inside of us that knows that there's something infinite. If you you can look at it this way. If you have time in a number line, and if you bring down the number line just to 1 point, and it just gets smaller and smaller, that point itself is infinite. That moment is all that exists. And so what we do is we take each eternal moment and create a silo and say, okay, I was in that eternal moment, and now I'm in this eternal moment, and now I'm in that eternal moment at each stage. Like putting a bracket around each eternal moment, which is kind of funny. The number line is filled with an infinite amount of dots, but we say, oh, this is 1 1/4 and 1 1/2 and 1 3/4 and 2, and we create it, we segment it into as if this is like a separate moment. If there's no time, if there's no, which is basically saying there's no numbers on the number line, then each point on the number line is infinite. And we're taking out any past, future, or even present. There's simply this number line that has no demarcations of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and in the negative, -1, -2, -3. So by looking at Sat Chit Ananda and existence, it takes away the numbers of the number line. And all there is the existence. Any questions so far? Anything that doesn't make sense there? All right. So then the questioner says next, I meditate neti neti. That means not this, not this. And so he's probably saying, what my meditation is I meditate on neti neti, not this, not this. I negate everything as unreal. And Maharishi responds, no, that's not meditation. Find the source. You must reach the source without fail. The false I will disappear and the real I will be realized. So in traditional Advaita Vedanta, there's neti neti, which is negation, and the other side is assertion. Okay, so if you've never been, I know Mary's been to Cincinnati, but most of you probably haven't been to Cincinnati, and I'm trying to tell you where Cincinnati is. I would say, well, Cincinnati's not in California. Cincinnati's not in New Mexico. And Cincinnati's not in Florida. And Cincinnati's not in Maine. Nor is Cincinnati in Minnesota. And you would probably say, okay, you're negating everything, but I'm still not getting any closer to have any idea where Cincinnati is. And so that's what he's getting to. Merely negating everything in the world is not going to get you any closer to self, just like negating where Cincinnati is not. It's not in this particular state is not going to get you any closer to finding Cincinnati. So you have to start asserting Cincinnati. And so if I said, it's in Ohio, and you go, I don't know where Ohio is, and I would start finding out a place where you've been. And I go, well, have you ever been to Michigan? You say, yeah, I've been to Michigan. And so I go, oh, well, Ohio's right underneath Michigan. Oh, so is that? And then you say you think it's in Pennsylvania because it's also underneath Michigan. And you say, no, maybe it's under, I don't know. But the point is, then I would specifically say, well, have you ever been to Detroit? And you say, yeah, I've been to Detroit. I said, well, Cincinnati's 5 hours south of Detroit on Highway 71 or 75. I forget which one you take. So then you start getting an idea now of asserting. Oh, okay. I know where Michigan is. I know where Detroit is, and I know what south is, and I know Highway 75, and that becomes clear. And so what he's saying is, if you continue to think about where Cincinnati is based on things that you know, then you will reach the source by asserting the I, and the false I will disappear, and the real I will be realized. Just as you continually to search for Cincinnati, you will find out what Cincinnati is, and you will naturally not look for Cincinnati in Maine, Florida, or California. Any questions there? So again, I would say, well, how can I use this as a practical on a practical level? So when you're seeking and trying to get knowledge, you try to think about, what am I actually trying to learn, and what am I trying to obtain in this self-inquiry or in getting self-knowledge? It's not to get a full understanding of all the 50 states, or in the continent, 48 states. It's to try to get an understanding of just one thing, self. So you don't need to know all about Maine. You don't need to know all about Texas. You don't need to know all about Montana in order to know about Cincinnati. All you need to know is about Cincinnati. So that means I don't need to know about Texas. I don't need to know about Florida. And when you start doing that, it's relief of the burden of having to think that you need to know a lot of concepts that are not necessary. So it's a elimination or renunciation of concepts and of knowing, rather than accumulating more information. So the process of self-inquiry is for you on your own to establish, what is it that I need to know, and what is it that is not really helpful and I don't need to know? What is necessary and what is not necessary? And that's called discrimination. And discrimination is just the other side of the coin of renunciation. And they work hand in hand. They help each other. So as you learn to let go of concepts, your discrimination is improved, your judgment, your discernment is improved, on what do I need to let go and what is something that's going to help me understand self. And that's a big crux of another cornerstone of Advaita Vedanta, is this renunciation on one side of the coin, and then on the other is this judgment, discerning capability, or it's called viveka, understanding. But when we mean understanding, it means judgment and discernment in relationship to renunciation. They work hand in hand. So it may be like, oh, well, I don't need to think about that concept. I'll let it go. And then your discernment kicks in later on. You say, oh, wait a minute, I do need to bring that concept back in. I thought that I didn't need to do that, but it is important that I have that concept to help me. Another way to think of it is that the judgment, discernment, viveka is one wheel of the bicycle, and another wheel is renunciation. So it's about letting go with discernment. Yes, Alan.
So the just lost it again. If I thought about what it is that's constant, like you were saying, throughout my whole life, the body changes and the mind changes in certain ways, and there's something that's constant. Would that be the same as the sun in the bucket?
Yes. Yeah.
And that would be a pointer towards the self.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So that may, practically that means, I've heard often that people say, it feels like I've been seeking my whole life. So seeking has been constant throughout the whole life. Okay, you say, all right, that's constant. Seeking's been happening my entire life. That's been there while the body's been changing. It's been there through various relationships. It's been there through seeing people come and go in and out of my life. It's been there while I've changed jobs. It's there. And so now, that's kind of like saying, seeking's been constant throughout my whole life. And that is kind of like saying, all right, Ohio is underneath Michigan. Now, to try to get to Cincinnati from Detroit, I would say, well, who or what is doing that seeking? Because obviously I'm not doing it, because what I consider myself is always changing. So therefore, there's something other than me, and call it impersonal, has been doing the seeking, and it hasn't been me. And that's like, oh, okay, now I know the highway to get down to Cincinnati. That would be one path towards the self. It's like, okay, if I'm not doing the seeking, then who or what is? And then when you have that deep intuitive belief in that there's something other than you doing the seeking, then, as he says earlier, the miseries will fall off. And the false I will fall off. The false I, in the sense, I think I'm doing the seeking. So someone could think, and again, I see this happening a lot, well, the seeking has ended. And then for various reasons, they think the seeking has ended. But if you're not doing the seeking is going to be there until the seeking completes itself. And that is like, oh, okay, well, I gotta bring this concept back in, because what I really feel like is that I'm not doing the seeking, but the seeking is still there. So so that particular person would say, okay, what I really mean to say is that I don't feel like I'm doing the seeking anymore. The identification as I'm doing the seeking is not as strong anymore. And I see that there's something else propelling this, pushing forward the seeking. And I want to know what that source is. And that's what he's saying. Try to go towards that, find that source. You must reach the source without fail. The false I will disappear. So by false I, and the real I will be realized. So again, when I was reading this stuff, I would say, well, let me take that into one particular concept. So in the seeking, that means that false I will disappear. Translated means I will not have the feeling that I'm seeking, and the real I will be realized. I will start to have the feeling that there's a energy outside of myself, or something outside of myself is doing the seeking through me. I don't feel I am the doer anymore. I'm really, someone say, I'm really starting to feel that. I don't feel like I'm the doer. I feel like something else is working in and through me. And that's pointing to the real I. So what he's suggesting is, or I guess what I'm suggesting is to find something that you resonate with that has been with you your whole life. Whether it's a concept, an idea, the seeking, or whatever, that's been with you your whole life while everything else has been changing. And focus on that rather than the changing. He says, you must reach the source without fail. So he's pretty serious about it. I would say in your free time, do it. But he's saying without fail. So it happens naturally. That's what I would say. It starts happening naturally when you start seeing things a little bit more clearly. Just thinking about, okay, yeah, I think there's a possibility that there's something that's been with me my whole life. It's just a possibility. I'm open to that possibility. And then you start to inquire into it. Okay, yeah, I think I'm starting to believe in it. I think that I'm starting to believe that there's something been, with me my whole life throughout all these changes. And then when you start to have that deep belief, then things start taking over and things become more revealed. So we don't quite know what the translation is. You must reach the source without fail. Someone can interpret that, well, I must do that. Like I'm in charge here and I must do it. It will take care of itself when the right direction, as far as pointing your attention to in the right direction. And that's up to every individual. And that right direction, though, is whatever's been constant throughout your whole life. Any questions there? Alan, okay, all right.
So when I think about that, about what's been constant my whole life, I recognize it as, and I think it has qualities, but I can't think of any word to describe the quality of it. And it does seem like kind of, well, it's me, something like that. It's, and what the me refers to usually is something that's changing all the time, but the thing that's constant, I call me also.
Mm-hmm. Like
And
the capital M E.
well, maybe, but yeah, I guess so. It, I mean, it's funny to hear myself saying it, but it does seem like a sense of presence or awareness that um, that's that's always been there, and it seems like it has a quality, but I don't, or it should, or I should be able to describe it as something, but I don't seem like it can.
No, it's actually better if you don't have a quality to it, because once you get a quality to it, then you can easily get locked into that as it. So it's
Uh,
actually, if you and I may have misrepresented this, but if you have in just a vague impersonal sense of some kind of something other than you, and when you were talking and said me, the thought came up like your true essence,
mm, mm, mm,
and it can't be really articulated. And so I would say, yeah, that's okay. That just having this vague sense of this is my essence instead of being locked into a description of it, that's a good thing.
mm.
And then when you're inquiring into that, you can ask yourself, well, how does that feel after the inquiry? And so if you're having this kind of vague sense and openness, um, and not trying to lock in a description of it, there would be this openness to it as as like after effect. You'd be more open rather than trying to strain and inquire and to say, I want to
Oh, I see.
find what pure consciousness is. I want to be able to label it. I want to be able to lock it in and say, this is it. But implied in that is that there's someone as a subject, an individual wanting to know it. So keeping it as a mystery and just having this vague understanding is doing a couple things. At one time, it's focusing the attention not on the small self but on the big self, and at the same time, it's giving the intellect humility and keeping it in a mystery. And the third thing it's doing, it's slowly dissolving the intellect, because when there's humility and knowing that I'm not going to get it, I'm not going to grasp it, then he says earlier, the false I will disappear. So that's another example of how practically the seeking of trying to find this out and trying to lock it into a description that this is pure self, this is pure consciousness. Pure consciousness is fill in the blank, and I got the answer. When that ceases and even begins to cease, then there's less misery. Any other questions? All right, so now we're on page 26. The fact that man, this is Maharishi, the fact is that man considers himself limited, and there arises the trouble. The idea is wrong. He can see it for himself. Now he's trying to show next that how can you see that you're limited? In deep, dreamless sleep, there was no world, no ego, no limited self, and no trouble. Okay, that's a nice little tidbit there. It's actually like one of the keys to happiness. If you want happiness in daily living, know that this, if you really understand this concept, in deep sleep, in deep dreamless sleep, there was no world, no ego, no limited self, and no trouble. Something wakes up from the happy state and says, I. To that ego, the world appears. Being a speck in the world, he wants more and gets into trouble. I like this idea about getting into trouble. How happy he was before the rising of the ego. Only the rise of the ego is the cause of the present trouble. Let him trace the ego to its source, and he will reach that undifferentiated happy state, which is sleepless sleep. The big self remains ever the same here and now. There is nothing more to be gained because the limitations have wrongly been assumed. There is the need to transcend them. So this whole thing resonates with me. This is like beautiful. It's probably a close translation too. I wonder about the word trouble, but it's kind of funny. So there's no trouble when the ego's not there, and there's trouble when the ego is there. Therefore, what's the trouble? The ego. There's no ego in the deep sleep state, and there's bliss. That's why they call it the Anandamaya Kosha, the bliss sheath. There is trouble in the waking state. So you say, well, what's the difference between the waking state and the deep sleep state? What is present in the waking state that is absent in the deep sleep state? And you think, let me see. Ego. Ego is the one that's missing and the one that's present. Is one that's absent and one that's present. So imagine if the ego is dissolved in the waking state, there would be happiness. Now the next, yes, Alan, hold on. Okay, Alan.
There's no sense of I in the deep sleep state, though. Also, is there?
Well, it depends on what you mean by I, because he says something wakes up from the happy state and says I. Now, it's just to be clear, because here it's a capital I with quotation marks. And so if you mean that there's no I as Alan or ego, yes, there is no I in the deep sleep state. Go ahead.
How do we know there's a capital I in the deep sleep state?
Well, that's a good question. So this is where you would say, okay, first let me accept, or at least for right now, let me accept that the absence of the ego is what is happening in the deep sleep state. Now you take away the ego out of any situation, what remains is what?
The self.
The self, right. So the self is being reflected in its most purest form indirectly in the deep sleep state, just like the sun is being reflected in its most purest sense in the bucket of water. So that's how we know that there's a presence other than ourself that occurs in the deep sleep state.
There's no experience to hold on to of it.
No
to say, oh, that's what it was.
Right. So just as the something wakes up from that happy state and says, I, that's what starts creating the trouble. I had a peaceful sleep because I didn't have any dreams. Well, wait a minute, you were gone, you were absent. So that I that's in this book, which is in quotation marks and a large I, is the culprit. Or we would say it's the claiming I. And that starts everything in the direction of misery.
So I had a thought. Tell me if this is useful or not. That's like light going through space, and there's no object for it to shine on. You could say, well, there's nothing happening, but the light's there, and if there's an object, then it's illuminated. So the object is like the ego, or the light is like the self, but it can't be seen because if there's nothing for it to reflect on. So it just exists, but without there's no objectiveness in it.
Well, let's use that metaphor of light, and the light. This is going to sound kind of weird, but the light of the pure self is being reflected in the deep sleep state, because the deep sleep state is an object, right?
I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yes. So as pure consciousness reflected in the deep sleep state, you get peace.
Okay.
So the argument, if someone were to make an argument about the nature of pure consciousness being Sat Chit Ananda, this is Ananda, part of Sat Chit Ananda. This is the bliss sheath. This is the bliss which manifests in the bliss sheath. So Sat Chit Ananda exists, let's say, out in the ether as this concept, Sat Chit Ananda, existence, knowledge, and bliss. But it manifests as bliss in the deep sleep state, or in that bliss sheath. And they say, oh, that's the very nature of the deep sleep state, is bliss. That's its nature, actually. It's just like saying a sugar cube is sweet, pepper is bitter, deep sleep state is bliss. Does that make sense?
I'll sit with it.
Yeah, sit with it. But this is the argument for knowing that the culprit is the ego.
Okay.
Because you say that there is no ego in the deep sleep state, and there's peace, and there is ego in the waking state, and there is potential for trouble.
And if there's a waking state with no ego, then there isn't trouble.
Exactly. That's what he's saying. So what's the commonality is either it's not the states of consciousness, it's the ego that's the trouble. That's what he's saying here.
Yeah, okay. Because that sense of presence that's been there all along, there's no trouble in that.
There's no trouble in presence. Right. There's no trouble in presence. Yes, our Steve.
So, Bala, the oneness experience and the deep sleep state. In the oneness experience, also, there is no I, although retrospectively there is. But I mean, when it's there, it's not there.
Yes.
And same way, deep sleep, no I. So they're similar in that sense.
Yes.
And they're different in the sense that oneness happens when one is awake, and the dreamless sleep happens when one is asleep. That's it. So I'm pointing to what's similar and what's different.
Right.
But that's, I think there is something more to what I'm saying. So if could you?
Yes. So let's back up a little bit. So pure subjectivity by itself is not conditioned by anything. It's independent from anything outside of itself for existence. And that's the existence part of Satchidananda. The knowledge part is knowing that it exists through the three states of consciousness. And the bliss part is knowing that when it's manifested, it's going to manifest in the deep sleep state without the ego, or it's going to manifest in the waking state without the ego. So know that pure subjectivity is not dependent on the three states of consciousness. It's a way to manifest the pure subjectivity. And it has to manifest through this for all beings, has to manifest through these three states of consciousness for everyone. And so each individual has a unique experience going through the three states of consciousness, and at the same time has the same experience of either having bliss in the deep sleep state, which is the same for everyone because there's no ego. And in the waking state, if there's no ego, there's also bliss for everybody. Because the ego is what creates the separation, the individuality. You take that out, there's bliss. And you put it back in, then there's going to be trouble. So what this does is strips away the ego by saying, when even upon waking, when you say, I had a peaceful, deep sleep, and you say, okay, well, I caught myself, it was deep sleep existed because I wasn't there, then you could also assert, then therefore that peace existed for any particular body-mind mechanism going through that state of consciousness in deep sleep. It's all the same for every being in that deep sleep state, because there's no individuality. It's, as we talked about, vasana, which has not sprouted yet. It's a seed. We don't know what seed is there. I could plant a oak tree seed on the ground, and I could plant a rosebush tree seed on the ground and underneath, and I see soil. I don't see the individuality yet. It's just bliss, which is the soil. And that's the same for everyone. And then when you start thinking that way, then that itself starts stripping the ego away. It's like, oh, not only did I have the absence of the I in deep sleep, but everybody does. And upon waking, everybody, as long as there's an ego, can get into trouble.
One more thing I wanted to ask you, even in the last session, was the waker sometimes is aware of the dreamer in the form of imagination, let's say. Could you please give me some idea about how the absence of the I can be tapped or identified now? Or is it very individual?
So tell me a little bit more. What do you mean, like give you?
No, okay. So right now I'm the Vishva, right? So the Vishva knows that that the Tejas, the dreamer, is here, right? It shows up when there's imagination, the daydream. Mm-hmm. And it also means to the Vishva, to the waker right now, that the Pragya, the deep sleeper, is also here. Mm-hmm. I, as a waker, know more easily that the dreamer is here, but I, as the waker, can't see the deep sleeper at all. Mm-hmm. The existence of the dreamer is known when there is imagination about something. Mm-hmm. The existence of the deep sleeper is not known at all.
Right.
That is the door I'm asking for.
So this is a good question. The waker is not really experiencing the dreamer, like you said, but it can, through imagination, relive the dream. So what is it I would ask you, what is it that's constant between the dreamer and the waker?
Knowing.
The what?
Knowing of it.
The knowing of it would be the part of the knowing of all three states of consciousness. The knowing that you have it's the same knowing that you have of, I know that there was a dreamer and I know there's a deep sleeper. But what is it that has a commonality between the deep sleep that in the dreamer and the waker that's not there in the deep sleep?
The ego.
And
the I sense.
Specifically, what? I mentioned it a little while ago.
The I sense, right?
The vasanas.
The vasanas, yes.
Yes. So the vasanas are what's common to the ego, but not common to the deep sleeper. Because the deep sleeper is the absence of the ego or vasanas, and that's why there is peace. So even in the dream state, there's a little bit of vasanas happening. Their vasanas are starting to manifest, and so we get into a little bit of trouble in the dream. And then we wake, and then we're relieved from that because we now become the waker. But the thing that's constant, in fact, the thing that sort of connects the dreamer and the sleeper are the vasanas. But the vasanas are negated in the deep sleep state, which is another reason to say vasanas belong to the dreamer and waker, and those are part of the ego. Therefore, I am not the waker or the dreamer. I am that which is the absence of, which is peace.
So that is the door then.
That's the door, right. So I'd simply say, vasanas of this body, so the language I would use is, it's not, I had a dream last night. The vasanas of this body-mind mechanism in the dream were such and such being manifested, and now they're simply continuing in the waking state. But it's the vasanas that limits the individual. That's, he says in the very beginning, the fact is that man considers himself limited, and there arises the trouble. When I think I'm the waker, or that I have some connection with the dreamer, that is limiting me. And so I actually know that there's a waker now, that there's a dreamer, and a deep sleeper. I know that. There's simply a knowing of it. And that knowing is part of Sat Chit Ananda. Existent, that's the knowledge part. It gives me goosebumps to start thinking about this stuff. It's like, it's just proving our limitation. We start arguing about it, then we say, start thinking about it and inquiring and arguing for our existence. It shows the very thing we're arguing proves our limitation. That's the beautiful concepts. Gives me goosebumps. Alan.
So you were saying, I have some confusion because you seem to be saying the vasanas are part of the ego. So then it implies if the ego goes, the vasanas go. But then also the vasanas are part of the body-mind mechanism. And of course they don't go. The
right.
Identification would go, right?
Yes. So it's the claiming me that would. So that now you're just doing a good job of self-inquiry. So what does it mean by the ego? The ego, obviously, what he means here is the claiming of the vasanas. That's a good point. The vasanas will continue, but they'll be looked at as the vasanas of the particular body-mind body-mind mechanism. that goes through, that is unmanifested in the deep sleep states, partially manifested in the dream, and then fully manifested in the waking. But I am not those. And then I am not even the bliss that exists in the deep sleep. I am beyond that. Because if I think I'm the bliss, if I think my true nature is the bliss in the deep sleep state, then I have to have the deep sleep state in order to I'm limiting myself as pure self. So then we can take it, well, what does this look like in practical daily living? Practical daily living is say, okay, I am not my vasanas. The vasanas are manifesting. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says beings function according to their vasanas. What can restraint do? So people are functioning according to their vasanas. Or the body-mind mechanism is functioning according to their vasanas. It can't be changed. And if that was seen, if that were seen, then there would be acceptance. And again, there wouldn't be any trouble. So using the three states of consciousness again is a cornerstone of Advaita Vedanta, because we go through it and it's like we're experiencing it and we can inquire into it. And you can see that, yeah, there's no trouble in deep sleep. There's only trouble in the dream state and in the waking state, and the trouble is due to the ego. Therefore, no ego, no trouble. So to sum up, we talked about this idea of creation. And if we think of this idea of creation, that things are always being created, there must be a creator to do that. And that is not the state of realization, because in order for something to be created, there has to be a creator. And something that's being created goes through a maintenance period and a destruction period. And so that's why he says in self-realization, there is no creation. And then he talks about seeing the big self. Now, remember, seeing this is not by the physical eye, it's being perceived through what we would call the third eye, which is not a physical eye, but something that is beyond the limited concepts and understanding. It's a different type of understanding. And then we talked a little bit about the difference between who am I and what am I. That was on page 25. He introduced the concept of Satchitananda, existence, knowledge, and bliss, and how when you forget that, all miseries crop up. But when it's held fast, then there is no misery. And then someone asked, well, do I meditate on not this, not this? And gave the analogy of, it's like saying this California is not where Cincinnati is. Florida is not where Cincinnati is. And how in the pursuit of the source, the false I will begin to fall away. And then we talked about how the individual is really limiting themselves by thinking that they're only the waker, but it's in the ego is absent in the deep sleep state and is present in the waking state. There's trouble in the waking state. There's no trouble in the deep sleep state. Therefore, it's the ego that is the trouble. Any final questions?
Yeah, I just unmuted myself because it looks like I've been frozen.
Yes. Oh, okay, good.
So, this conclusion that because there's trouble in the waking state, there's trouble in the dream state, but not in the deep sleep state. Therefore, the trouble is the ego.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, I can say, there's no trouble in the deep sleep state because nothing's happening. Nothing troublesome is happening. I mean, there's like nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see that it's necessarily a conclusion that it's because of the ego in the dream state and the waking state.
So what is that nothingness?
Well, it's not really nothingness in the sense, I guess, that there's a recognition that it exists. But
What would you say for you exists in deep sleep state?
oh, I guess I would describe it as pure existence.
Pure existence. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's
Okay. So it's pure existence, and that is what's present in the deep sleep state. Right?
right.
Okay. I can't see because whether
Right. Yeah, that's what's present in the deep sleep state. Although I also think of it as just being all dark.
okay.
That's, it's like blackness.
Right. So does pure existence exist in the waking state?
Right.
And pure existence exists in the dream state.
Right.
So what is it that's preventing the apperception of pure existence in the waking state?
Well, I mean, I know that I know from what we've been taught or whatever that it would be the ego,
Mm-hmm.
the identification.
Right.
That the identification isn't with, as it were, the bliss.
Right.
But it's all the relative things.
So it comes back to ego.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. All right, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste.